record. All right, welcome everybody to another YANA monthly town hall. This month, we are exploring fighting inequality outside the US, lessons learned from abroad. We have three great speakers with us who have a variety of worldwide experiences. And Tiffany Gardner, who I think has some international experience, is actually going to be talking to us about some political matters. So we'll get to that. But just wanted to say thank you to everybody for joining us and remind you that our YANA Gala, 10th anniversary gala, you can see it behind me, is on November 10th at 6:30 p.m. And we are going to have a great program lined up for you. So if you haven't already sponsored us, that'd be great. The program is free to everyone, but we want to make sure we can raise some money to continue this growing our network and supporting all of our programming. So without further ado, since we have a lot to cover, let me turn it over to Mick Hirsch. Mick is a Div school grad. You've seen his bio in the program. Mick's got some slides to share. He's been a longtime member of YANA and is also on the leadership committee for the New England chapter. And he is the the director of THRIVEGulu. So Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? I hope so. I'll assume that that's a yes. Great. Thank you so much. I first want to just thank my fellow panelists, Neal and Tiffany. It's a pleasure to be here tonight with you. And I also want to thank Rachel, Ken, Joellen, who's the chair of the New England chapter of YANA, and everyone else at YANA for bringing this organization to life. And what a contribution it is to Yale, but also to our wider community. So thanks to you for YANA. So my first impression regarding the three issues put forth for this event is that the common denominator of fighting inequality, extreme poverty, and social injustice overseas is healing the invisible wounds of psychological trauma. Now, two things. First, I have to give credit where credit is due. This incredibly poignant phrase, healing invisible wounds, is not mine, but rather that of our fellow Yale alum, Dr. Richard Malika, who, while he was completing his medical residency at the Yale Medical School and Yale New Haven Hospital, also completed a Master of Arts in Religion at the Yale Divinity School. I happened to study with him at that other Cambridge school, where he is the founder and director of the Harvard program in refugee trauma. And second, I just want to acknowledge that it may seem somewhat reductionistic for me to claim that trauma is a causal agent for all three, inequality, poverty, and injustice, but I will try to clarify that and tell you why I believe so strongly in this notion. So let's first refer back to Dr. Malika's kind of hidden signifier, the healing the invisible wounds of trauma. The identity of trauma is invisible, and so it evades easy diagnosis. So often, for example, we attempt to fight poverty in developing countries with money, with employment opportunities, with social enterprise, with innovation, and so forth. And to be sure, with the exception of attempts to remedy a problem by carelessly throwing money at it, I do not think that such approaches are necessarily misguided. But what I do see is that too many countries and too many individual women and men, boys and girls, are living in protracted situations of intergenerational poverty. And that really bothers me, like really, really bothers me. And in so many of these situations, these places and these people have had billions and billions of dollars spent on money dumps, employment opportunities, social enterprise, innovation, and so forth, and it hasn't really worked. I should say some of it has worked, and we've achieved some incredible and tremendous benchmarks, but collectively we haven't found that right formula that is replicable, sustainable, and affordable. The United States in 2019 alone spent $39.2 billion on foreign aid, while worldwide, the amount was $152.8 billion. Now, granted, for the US, that is less than 1% of the federal budget, but that is still an enormous amount of money, and it's not quite getting the job done, or at least it's not getting the job done fast enough or right enough. Models of international aid based on principles of neoliberal capitalism are simply not the solution, or at least they're not the only solution. Now, before I turn to Uganda, where I currently work, let's take a quick look at Cambodia. I lived and worked in Cambodia for 3 years. My wife and 2 children are 100% Cambodian. Cambodia is a country of breathtaking beauty. It's got beautiful people and just a fascinating cultural heritage. Cambodia was racked by one of the most devastating human-inflicted catastrophes in modern times. At least a quarter of the population was systematically murdered. Millions more were forcibly displaced. Their religion was desecrated, and their entire educated class was eradicated. There are no words for what took place in my wife's homeland. That war officially ended in 1979. Since then, billions of dollars have been spent. Yet when I was there, my albeit unscientific assessment revealed that rampant poverty was just everywhere. True, there's now a small middle class, particularly in the urban areas of Phnom Penh and Siem Reap, and a small elite class who drive custom-built Range Rovers and Rolls Royces. But the poverty, the inequality, the injustice was still everywhere, 35 years after the war. Now, I find it interesting that of all the billions of dollars given to Cambodia since the war ended, only a few tens of millions have been specifically allocated for mental health trauma recovery, despite the fact that Pol Pot's legacy was nothing short of ubiquitous trauma. A Fordham University study back in 2012 found that Cambodia spent 0.012% of its national budget on mental health. Now, let me just say that there are no 2 better ways to propagate social injustice, to subjugate and oppress a population, than to deprive them of a quality education and refuse them to reclaim a sound mind. Now, the same is pretty much true of northern Uganda in the aftermath of the terror perpetrated by Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army. This is the context where I currently work. I've been amazed at the similarities between northern Uganda and Cambodia in the aftermath of disaster. Each one, of course, is unique in its own right, but the way in which humans respond to complex trauma is something we need to look at if we are to conquer these 3 problems of inequality, poverty, and injustice. In addition to thinking hard about the most common economic solutions to address these problems, we also need to take a critical look at the few mental health programs that are out there to assess how effectively they really are at meeting the demands of complex social problems. For instance, there are a lot of programs that offer group counseling for women to share their experiences of something like sexual trauma and offer one another support. Now, those are much needed interventions, but what then? Are they sustainable? Is it replicable? Does it make sense? We always need to remember that what happens after the group therapy session is as significant as what happens during it. Moreover, it goes without saying that a Western model of psychotherapy is always already an imposition and a foreign solution, a foreign treatment for what is locally believed to be a spiritual or diabolical condition. So where does that leave us? In my humble opinion, we need to invest more in holistic programs and build the capacity of both existing organizations which focus primarily on economic empowerment or mental health. The organization which I serve, THRIVEGulu, certainly doesn't hold the universal key to helping survivors become thrivers. But I'm extremely proud to be part of an organization that embraces a holistic approach to trauma recovery. I think we're doing something special. And for the 3 years and 3 months that I've been with the organization, it has been a true blessing to know that at least in this little part of the world where we operate, we are doing something right. We are making a difference. We are seeing over the course of 3 years an 820% increase in income generation amongst our thrivers in empowerment groups. Our program stands on 2 interlocking pillars of support: mental health counseling and individual and community empowerment. This means that the majority of our beneficiaries, we call them thrivers because we consider them our partners, and at the end of the day, we are their beneficiaries as much as they ours. The majority of our thrivers are invited to form an empowerment group through which we offer a package of services. There is a microfinance component called a Village Savings and Loan Association, small seed money to develop income generating activities, business education, adult literacy, gender-based violence awareness and response, and of course, mental health counseling, all under one roof. It comes down to this, something I always say. It's hard not to be stressed and depressed when you've been traumatized from a war and live in abject poverty. And at the same time, it's hard to hold a job or sustain a small business when you've been deprived in education and are haunted by the past. We're a small organization and we take on a lot of responsibilities, but we hire professionals with diverse experiences to form an interdisciplinary team that means we have a different set of eyes looking out to see if there are needs here or there that can be referred internally. Of course, if there is something we cannot handle, we refer outside, utilizing our vast network of associates. But our model is such that if, for example, our literacy manager identifies signs of domestic violence in a language learner, a referral can be made to a colleague who is a gender-based violence professional, who can then also refer to one of our counselors. When the situation is under control, we can make sure that the survivor is able to take advantage of economic empowerment activities, helping her work towards self-reliance while building inner strength and confidence, and also join hands with others in the empowerment group. Now, that hypothetical survivor of domestic violence is a future group leader. We will build her by equipping her with leadership skills, knowledge about democratic governance, conflict mitigation, and other things. One day, she will offer support and inspiration to women just like her, and she will oversee an empowerment group, a community of support for both women and men, the latter of whom learn about gender equality and become advocates in their communities. Now, in conclusion, allow me to just quickly circle back to the trifold plagues that we are fighting. And I suppose if we were to add COVID-19, we'd be looking at 4 adversaries. The first, inequality. Beyond the obvious sorts of inequality, economic, gender, racial, there are also major inequalities working against people with disabilities, ethnic minorities, the LGBTQ community, and many others. Moreover, I see a major inequality that directly involves humanitarian support. I'll sound like Dr. Seuss for a minute and call it the gets and the get-nots, and also the gets what's good and the gets what's not good or not relevant. This sort of inequality has to do with who receives aid, how relevant that aid is, and how successful that aid is in addressing a real as opposed to a perceived or fabricated need, and that it does not create a cycle of aid dependency. Now I'm going to flip orders here and go to social injustice. Beyond land grabbing, oppression, deprivation, corruption, there is a tremendous injustice suffered by post-conflict societies, made manifest in the lack of or inability to trust. During wars, there is often a campaign of propaganda to brainwash people into not trusting one another. Hence, there is widespread suspicion of neighbors. Paraprofessionals who should be able to be respected and consulted, such as teachers, police, nurse, and even doctors, take advantage of their social position. Schools do not teach about the LRA or Khmer Rouge, leaving children, students, unable to critically assess for themselves the history of their homeland and their people. And importantly, stigma becomes normative and creates a culture of silent suffering. And finally, extreme poverty, not just of money, lack of jobs, dilapidated shelter, unclean water, food insecurity, but poverty of education, of ideas, of creative expression, of culture, and I'll underscore this one, of hope. I often think to myself that we need to steer more non-proselytizing, theologically trained graduates into the international aid sector. Because if there is one thing that is limiting human potential, it is a poverty of hope. But the thing about hope is that you can surround it with whatever adversarial words you want. You can attack it with whatever negative ideas you have. But as Cambodians and Ugandans will attest, hope is the resiliency of the survivor and the currency of the thriver. So thank you for that opportunity.
Mick, articulate and amazing and heart-wrenching as always. There are only 28 of us on the call, so if anybody wants to ask a question, you can just, I don't know if the chat, the hand raising, or you can just put it in the chat, and we can unmute you if you want to ask a question, or you can kind of take everything in. And we can do a full. Tiffany, can you go ahead? Do you want to?
This was amazing. Thank you. You actually talked about two places that are very near and dear to my heart. I too spent time in Phnom Penh several years ago and was back and forth a lot. So Cambodia means a lot to me, as does Uganda and that part of the world. Question for you, and I have so many questions, but my first question for you is, when you talk about trauma, just wondering, and this is such a rich topic, just wondering, when you talk about trauma and sort of addressing trauma, which is something that we don't even do sort of in US society, right? And there's so many, post PTSD you see all over this country in different pockets. But is there any place in your work, particularly in Uganda and Cambodia, that looks at traditional forms of dealing with trauma, be it traditional African forms? I know, like in Rwanda, for instance, after the genocide, right, they had their sort of like small kind of like councils and courts, right? That was basically community led. So just wondering sort of the dealing with trauma, which rarely doesn't happen, and needs to happen more of, right? But when you do deal with trauma, is it from sort of a Western point of view, or do you at all sort of envision sort of a local response to that, which can be very different from sort of how we as Westerners think of dealing with those issues?
Yeah, thanks, Tiffany. That's an outstanding question. It's also an extremely complex and difficult one. I'll try to answer it as quickly as possible. So you really have to work against a number of forces that are not in your favor. So one thing that I would point out to start is that there are very few individuals, who are trained in counseling and any kind of mental health practice. It's not a common discipline in universities. You've got few people. The people who do go to university and do receive training and education in counseling it's a purely Western approach. It's a purely Western model that the students are almost indoctrinated in. So they're almost taught to like disregard and diminish these kind of more traditional ways of healing, which there are negative things about them, because sometimes people go take an individual to a healer, and they're losing time sometimes because they're not getting treated as quickly as as they might be benefiting from. But there are some things that are being done. So some forms of therapy, narrative therapies, tend to be a little bit more allow for a greater expression of an individual's identity, in terms of their culture and their personal beliefs. So there are some things, and there are some attempts to kind of work with things like Khmer Crew and other sort of healers who are part of the traditional culture.
Thank you. Good points. I just put a recommendation. I usually don't do this, but I just happened to read the book, The Weirdest People in the World, and I highly recommend it. it really does give insight to kind of turning on its head traditional psychological views of psychology, and how it's all been Western viewpoint, and it really turns everything on its head. And you can see why. I mean, you use the term neoliberal capitalism, but even the concept of trauma, health, how people view kin versus, strangers, completely different around the world. And that seems like if that's taken, I don't know what, I've seen some good reviews, but if that really gets integrated into American training, maybe we'll get more people who can be trained and understand that there are more regional, local, psychologically based kind of approaches that would make much more sense than in a Western imposed one.
Yeah, just building on what you've all said, and Rachel, I really had the privilege to work with, I put her name in the chat, Alphonsine Mutabonwa-Bia of Rwanda, and she found exactly that. She's a nurse who fled Rwanda during the genocide, came back afterwards, wanted, using her medical approach, to work with women farmers who'd been absolutely devastated in every way imaginable. And what they told her, and she was a good listener, and she was local, but also just a good listener. And they said, we don't want to talk about our trauma. It will re-traumatize us unless we can move our lives forward. And Alphonsine, it turns out that in Kigali, the gooseberry grows wild, and children eat it on their way to and from school, just pluck it off bushes growing wild. And Alphonsine was searching, had just gotten plugged into the internet in the 1990s, and saw that in Europe, the gooseberry was prized for jellies and jams. And so she started a business and integrated traumatic informed care with farmers getting on their feet. She made the personal investment, they sold to Europe, and they created a thriving business. And the two really had to go hand in hand. And Mick, I'm curious, I know of other physicians in Africa who have taken this approach. I find it brilliant. It's so ahead of anything we've done here in the United States, in which when you're working in a deeply traumatized area, impoverished area, combining microfinance and skill building, workforce development with medical care in a one-stop shop really can be a game changer. And I'm just curious to know if you've seen that in Cambodia as well, and in other places.
I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it enough. Let's just at least say that. So, but I think one of the things that an organization like ours does is that we are also trying to provide some education and capacity building to different sectors of the society, and certainly the medical sector is one. And we spend a lot of time working with primary care facilities, so just local clinics, so that they can learn how to make just basic assessments that something's not right here. Maybe we should call Thrive, that sort of thing, and that works really well. I'm sure we need to press on, but just real quick, there was a question by Chip in the box, and Chip, all of the staff in Uganda are Ugandans. There is myself, and I have two colleagues who are both half-time, who are Americans that provide some support services, but everyone in Uganda is a Ugandan. So.
Okay, thank you, Mick. And if people have questions, we might be able to have time at the end. And Mick, maybe you want to put your website contact information if people want further questions later in the chat. I want to turn to Neal Keny-Guyer, and I'm just amazed there's Cambodia seems to be a common thread amongst but maybe not surprising if you're all into going into areas that most need help. So Neal, let's start with Cambodia, right? That was, before we get into your work, leader with Mercy Corps. Why don't you talk about how your journey into world beyond the United States and how that eventually brought you to Mercy Corps?
Yeah, but the only thing bad about that, it reminds me of how much older I am than Tiffany or Mick. I think I was there a little bit earlier in the killing fields of Cambodia. But like so many of us, for me, it was the Inspiring World event that put me on a humanitarian pathway. It occurred, I always say, sometime after my first marketing course at Yale SOM. Myself and two other students said we wanted to apply the principles of crisis management to refugee relief. That's old hat these days, but I can tell you in 1979, in the fall of 79, that was not old hat. And so we worked on a summer internship, were picked up by UNICEF and CARE, and found ourselves in the summer of 1980 on the Thai-Cambodian border. And it ended up that my job was actually to go inside Cambodia and bring out wounded to the hospitals that were on the border. So I don't think we would do that today, but it was a great immersion. And obviously that experience, you know, had a lasting impact on me. It led me to the career that I chose.
Yeah. So how did you wound up, I presume, finishing your degree at SOM and then went back and did a lot of work in the Middle East, in Africa?
Yeah, that's right. I actually ended up taking a year leave of absence. I started out in Cambodia, worked there for about 9 months, and then I went to the Horn of Africa, to Somalia after that. The Ogaden crisis was big at the time. And then I came back, completed my degree, and in the summer of 1982, I'm sure like a lot of people on this Zoom line, and you know, my hat's off to everyone, because I know everyone here is doing their own part to make the world a better place. But for me, I had one of those fateful decisions to make. Do I go back and work with inner city gang kids, or I'd spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. and in Atlanta, Georgia on doing that, or do I carry on following an international career? The Israelis invaded Lebanon in the summer of 1982. That was the big event of the world at that time. And Save the Children called me up and said, "Hey, Neal, would you go to Beirut for us?" And I said, I'll go until the fighting stops. And fortunately, after 3 years, they let me leave. But again, that had such a profound influence on me, on my thinking, and then on my subsequent career.
Okay. So then tell us how you found your way over to Mercy Corps, a few years after you had left Beirut.
Yeah, I spent 9 years with Save the Children, the bulk of that in the Middle East. And then in 1989, I got married. I realized that probably, spending 8 months on an airplane is not the best way to start a healthy marriage. And I actually ended up taking a couple years leave of absence, doing, I'd say, the hardest job I've ever done, which is being a full-time home dad with our first child, while my wife pursued her career. And so I did that for 2 years. I did some of my own consulting, and then I was ready to get back in. And I got contacted by Mercy Corps that was going through a leadership challenge. I actually had not really heard that much about the organization. I knew it was on the West Coast. We were in Palo Alto and wanted to stay on the West Coast. Portland, Oregon was a great place to raise a family. And also, I couldn't help but think, after my experiences with UNICEF, with CARE, and with Save the Children, sort of in the back of my mind, if I could ever run my own organization, what would I do differently? And, at the time, the organization was small enough, I always say fraught with opportunity, that I felt like I could really, go and apply some of those lessons learned and ideas of a different kind of organization.
So what was it that you implemented, you think, that really allowed you over, a quarter century to bring it from a small $5 million organization to a worldwide $450 million, major international NGO?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that I would say about that, one, it was a wild journey and incredibly meaningful and purposeful and a lot of fun. But you know, the key is to really get the right people. And I was lucky enough, you know, when I joined the organization, the headquarters had only 22 people in it. There were maybe 150 people around the world in 7 countries. And so I had an opportunity to really bring in a new team of leadership and to influence the organization that way. And I got lucky, and, you know, as someone said, always hire people smarter than yourself and do your best to stay out of their way. So that was important. Secondly, you know, when I took over, the big animating event in the world was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And all along those fault lines where the Soviet Union collapsed, it created, you know, sadly, new humanitarian opportunities. But if you were a small organization looking to make your mark, it kind of created a level playing field, because many of the traditional organizations had worked more in the traditional environments. And here you suddenly had new environments. It was wide open. And so that created a lot of opportunity. The third, and I'll give some credit to Yale SOM for this, was, you know, early on, and again, it's old hat today, but in 1994, people were not talking about social entrepreneurs and social innovation and social enterprise the way they do now and the way they did over the subsequent, you know, 10, 15, and 20 years. And so at least for the large international NGO sector, you know, if you could come in and be a little bit more innovative, use technology and you know, perhaps more bold ways, inculcate this sense of social entrepreneurship into the organization's culture, I think it gave you a real advantage. And it certainly gave an advantage for Mercy Corps. The second thing was to really be bold enough to say, you know, in many of the places that are driven by conflict, you can't go in with a naive concept of independence, impartiality, neutrality. If conflict, poor governance, poverty are the basis, you're going to have to find ways to work in the gray areas that really do bring about peace building, reconciliation, improve governance, if you're going to make a difference. And that was new. So by both bringing in more bold concepts of entrepreneurship and being willing to take conflict head on and really focus on peace building, I think that gave Mercy Corps an advantage.
You had mentioned that one of your key elements of how to make transformational change was innovation. You just talked a little bit about that.
Right.
And somebody had asked a question earlier about kind of, you know, bringing together economic independence with some of these other factors. You actually did that. Like, can you tell us about how there was the microfinance institutions and insurance companies and a bunch of other things you did in line with in the refugee work you were doing?
Yeah, we created a concept called the 3 I's, and it was impact, innovation, and influence. And, you know, they're all equally important. Impact, you know, kind of narrowly defined, was the sum total of your work. And as Mick said, no single organization is ever going to make the difference that we aspire to. It's really about the ecosystem. And so, and yet, you know, all of us care about our organizations and the direct impact that we have. But it's really what you do on that impact. It's the kind of innovation that you bring, the new ideas, the different uses of technology, the new kinds of partnerships, that, you know, the new kinds of analysis, that is so, so critical. And the third is influence. And, you know, that's often in the public policy realm, but not always. But it's using influence more broadly with a broader group of stakeholders. It's when you can bring influence and innovation and impact together that you have the possibility of transformational change. And in that regard, in terms of organizational structures, we were always indifferent as to whether it was for-profit, not-for-profit, or for purpose. And so we were able to set up about 13 microfinance institutions, as you said, an insurance company, and other organizations that endured long because they were local, because they had local governance, and we were indifferent about the form of organizational structure.
So when you talk about local stuff, this is along with some of the earlier questions. How did you go about recruiting, getting into these places all over the world? How did you choose that? How did you build your teams? And then what were the sort of that allowed them to sustain and grow and be sustainable partners? And then obviously you got a huge budget. You were able to secure major financing from, major other NGOs and governments and things. So what were some of the key factors that helped you do that?
Yeah, how we chose where we worked is we took a fragile states lens, really a conflict lens. Where does kind of extreme poverty, poor governance, and conflict collide and trap people? So not a traditional poverty lens, but so we were willing to go to the Afghanistan's, the Central African Republic, many places in the Middle East, Yemen, and so forth, and operate at scale in those kinds of environments. Obviously, as Mercy Corps grew, it grew to 6,000 people. 96% of those people were from the country where we worked, but we had a strong investment, I would say as much, if not more so than almost any other organization, in team development, particularly in your national team, because they're the key. They're the ones that make it happen. They're on the front lines, and, really investing in their management skills and their leadership skills and their emotional intelligence skills is absolutely important. And, just to pick up on Mick, I think increasingly we recognize that in those environments, a lot of your team members are going to suffer their own forms of trauma. And so it's really important that you pay attention to burnout and the sort of trauma and PTSD that comes from just working and living in those kinds of environments. And then the third, again, I think the reason the organization was successful at attracting resources, it was partly working in some of the world's toughest places where you didn't have every organization in the world kind of clamoring to jump into, being able to operate with scale, with accountability, with never perfect, but always trying with transparency. But third, by trying to work in a way that addressed root causes and brought about real sustainable change, even though that's hard, and even though it's always about the ecosystem and never just the individual organization. I think that enabled Mercy Corps to attract a wide range of resources from around the world.
So with that concept of change and transformation and stability, I asked you this question last time, but do you think the world is better than it was in 1979 and 80, or is it just, have you seen more of it? What's your kind of take of where we are globally now than we were maybe in 1980?
Yeah, all the optimists in me wants to say, oh, we're in a better place. We're making progress. But the determined realist in me says, I'm actually worried about where we are now. I think the world is more fragile than perhaps it was in 1980. You remember there were books being written about the end of history. That was a lot of hubris, but there was a sense in which, particularly in the post-Cold War period, that the world was going to get better. We saw all the elimination of extreme poverty in China and India and so many other, in Indonesia and other. It really looked like the world was getting better. When you scratch the surface, you saw rising inequality. You saw in many of these fragile states that poverty hadn't changed at all. And when you looked at kind of indices of freedom and good governance, there were reasons to worry. But still, there was a lot of optimism. If you went to places like Davos or the Aspen Institute and so forth, there, people were fairly optimistic. I think now, when you look at the world, everyone recognizes that, a lot of the global institutions, the UN, the World Bank, and so forth, that were created in a very different time are no longer fit for purpose. We just don't know what replaces them. We're back to big power relationships and rivalries. It's a tough world out there right now, and probably at the point in which we need to work together more than ever to solve the really big issues of our time, whether it's a global pandemic or extreme inequality or poverty or climate, whatever those big issues are. the world has never been more fractured. And so that does give me pause. I'm encouraged by some of the new kinds of organizations that I see. I'm encouraged by some of the technological breakthroughs, although, we see, the power of social media all over the world and the downsides of that in so many places around the world. But overall, I would say that I'm more concerned than I've been a long time about the future of the world. But that ought to just give us more reason to get engaged, get involved, and bring our best.
Yeah, I guess we're sort of hoping to be like, oh, we're on the right path. But yeah, there seems to be a lot of stuff. And you'd mentioned these sort of traditional organizations, the World Economic Forum, the UN, and how are those institutions going to be, what's their place? You mentioned they're probably good for convening world leaders and ideas. Maybe it's social and entrepreneurship and innovation and support locally on the ground. It's kind of scary. You've been in a lot of trauma-ridden places around the world. I'm sure you've seen stuff that's just would break your heart. What are some good stories of what kind of kept you going and helps you realize that you were doing the right stuff and doing some good work?
The thing that always kept me going is I was very privileged to have the opportunity to travel a lot of the time. I always traveled 50% of the time, even when my kids were young. And as they got older and out of the house, I traveled 75% of the time, and mostly to the front lines, mostly, if nothing else, just to say thank you to people there. But it was, the people that you would meet there, and particularly young people that that we would work with, they always inspired me. There was one story, I'll never forget, because I spent so much time in the Middle East. I obviously have a big heart for the place, and I've spent a lot of time in Gaza, and have worked a lot with young people there. And I've met some amazing young people. One was a young woman named Reem, and I'll never forget. And this was right after one of the Hamas-Israeli wars. It was really bad in Gaza. It was like the first day it was open, and I was able to get in. And I was there, and I watched the television crew go up to Reem and go, Reem, and they were obviously looking for controversy, and they said, okay, now you've just been through this war. It's a tragedy. Does this make you want to pick up the gun? And, kind of without missing a beat, she looks up, she pauses, and she goes, yes. Of course, the camera then zeroes in. Then she goes, the gun of knowledge, because the gun of hope, right? The gun of caring, the gun of peace. That's the gun I want to pick up. And I could tell a zillion stories about, people, especially young people that I've met like that, always encourage you, always give you hope.
Beautiful. Well, I'm sure people will have some questions about some other aspects of the organization. You did tremendous work there. And I just want to move a little bit now to, the unfortunate instances that happened back in the States that, might have caused you to depart sooner than you did. I don't know if people may know it or not, but do you want to just tell, in your own words, kind of what happened that led up to your resignation?
Yeah, well, I resigned from Mercy Corps just about a year ago. We're at the anniversary of that. And, around an issue that I don't think I could have ever imagined or anticipated. This was the daughter of one of the founders came forward through a hotline saying that she had been sexually abused by her father. And at the time the hotline complaint came through, her father had been dead for 15 years. As it turns out, which none of us knew at the time, there had been an investigation, before I arrived, before my time. There was a bit long story done of this. The Oregonians surfaced some things that had never come about. When it became public, it was probably the most searing thing I had ever experienced. It rocked the organization to its core. It seared my own soul. And in the course of that, I just felt that, that as the leader for 25 years, that how we responded to the hotline, we did respond, but we didn't bring what we knew was the right approach, which was a survivor-centric approach. And I should have paid more attention to that. And as the leader, that's ultimately on me. And if my resignation can help, can help a survivor heal, can help an organization that I love heal, can enable people to move forward in a positive way, maybe there'll be some lessons learned out of this for the whole community, then that's the right thing to do. And so I made the painful decision to resign. It was painful. It's been a hard year. There've been a lot of things learned. I think we all grow through those kinds of experiences, but the organization has endured. It's in great hands. It's got a fantastic new CEO who just started about a week into her term. She will be terrific. So, as painful as it was, I still take a lot of pride and joy in the organization and will always be a big supporter.
So what are some of the things you learned from, that experience? Obviously, you had already set up a tremendous policy on transparency and for the ability. And I understand it may not be unusual in overseas that there could be complaints or concern, or you have to monitor people all over the world. What would you recommend to other directors who are running big international organizations, but also have a very strong and large, home US base?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, I am doing some writing. I'll have more to say about this, and hopefully in a way that'll be useful and helpful. But just, very quickly, and this sounds so obvious because, it would have been, had this been an allegation against a current Mercy Corps team member, had it occurred on a Mercy Corps pride and so forth, it would have triggered a much different response to this. And there were some extenuating circumstances where our top safeguarding person was leaving and in transition. And so, but anyway, just the first lesson for any leader anywhere is, one, always use a safeguarding approach. I think if the safeguarding approach had been, and in this case, team members who are trained in dealing with sexual trauma, with abuse, and would be communicating with a person who comes forward, not through your legal channels. Always do that. We all know that, but just, I don't think you can emphasize that enough. Two, and especially if you're, have been in the position for a long time. I was there for 25 years. I do think, at that length of time, you can kind of get disconnected maybe from the headquarters, disconnected from some of the day-to-day, but issues like this are always so important. Issues that strike at the heart and culture of an organization, you've just got to really pay attention to and keep your antennae finely tuned on that. And then the third is, without becoming so risk averse that you don't take any risk out there. I think you've got to have your sort of risk mitigation policies in place, finely tuned, and your governance process is open and transparent enough that they're capturing this complex world that we live in now fully and wisely. So those are three that immediately come to mind. And then just on a personal level, what I would say is, a lot of what I learned and appreciate, and where I think, hopefully I'll be a better person is I think you suddenly becomes clear that whatever we accomplish externally, whatever recognition or accolades might come our way, they are all ultimately fleeting. And what truly matters, is the love of family, the quality of your relationships that, and I don't know how anybody goes through any kind of a crisis, without that kind of support system. It was critical for me. And I can, and you see it all the time, how important that is for all of us.
Well, thank you for sharing. And I know the world is a better place for the work that you've done in building Mercy Corps.
Thank you.
And even through this personal process, I hope, as you process this, you might have further lessons to share. And it is unfortunately not, unique. It may have, this particular circumstance was, but, these things pop up all the time. Particularly, I know we're seeing this in the K-12 educational space. And the better we can all be attuned and make sure, as you said, safeguarding policies and the right people around, and thinking about how we make things safer for everyone that work in any of these jurisdictions and organizations. I wanted to open it up if there are questions to ask before I turn to Tiffany. You can either, again, there are only about 27 of us here or something, so you can raise your hand or put it in the chat, or you can wait to the end and we can ask a bunch of questions for everybody. Chip Levengood had asked how you draw on the local community resources, aspirations, and the needs when you were planning your projects in these various locations. You said 99% of the people you hire are the local ones. What about in designing and how to get a successful outcome? How was that done?
Yes, I mean, I think that's just got to be baked in. Mick talked about it for his work, that that's a cardinal principle of any good development work. And in the Mercy Corps, there were always vehicles, whether it was partnerships with a local community organization, whether it was working with local leaders, whether it was working with women's groups or youth groups. All of those, again, were part of the local ecosystem. Were brought in, early on in the assessment of needs and the design of any response, as well as in any evaluation and lessons learned, so that those insights, those voices, those stakeholders are key parts of the process from A to Z.
Great. Thank you. All right. So we just hang out there. We might have some more questions going. And Tiffany, I want to turn it to you. We have enough time. Now, this is a sort of a special, if you want to unmute yourself, Tiffany, so we can start the conversation. If you don't mind, could we pick up a little bit from some of your international experience? I think the last time I saw you were doing a spotlight with One World Exchange, and you certainly had a lot of international exposure there, and would love to hear how you came to the place where you are now. Is it ReflectUS or ReflectUS?
ReflectUS.
ReflectUS, great. So we want to hear more about that, but if you could give us a little bit about your path and maybe, and then tell us about what you're doing now and why that's so important.
Sure, and I have a brief presentation as well. So so I started my work internationally, much like Mick and Neal, and it's funny because I never thought I would be doing domestic public service work. I always saw myself as an internationalist, so I sort of grew up looking sort of outside of the U.S. Started as an undergraduate at Yale, did a study abroad in South Africa right after the end of apartheid, and found myself interning with female parliamentarians there. And the one thing that was so exciting about that time is that South Africa, being a new democracy, had a chance to get it right, or sort of as close to right as possible, with the new constitution. And so written into that constitution, gender parity in government. And so again, I interned for some of those female parliamentarians. And then after that, I went off and worked in Ghana and did microcredit lending in rural Ghana, right on the border of Togo and Ghana there, and working with female farmers. This was many moons ago when, microcredit and microfinance was sort of a new thing. And so I'm really sort of cutting my teeth there, working with female farmers who were leaders in their community and seeing the power of being able to control their own economics in that. And then went off to law school and did some work at the UN for a while, and then found myself in Cambodia, in fact, in Phnom Penh, and working with both domestic violence survivors, as well as women in sex trafficking, and figuring out, how do you empower women? And so I guess the theme throughout all of my work had been women empowerment, unbeknownst to me, in these different areas. And then I came back and I founded One World Exchange, which you spoke about, and really was looking then at sort of like within our sort of democratic experiment that we call the US, who's inside and who's outside, and really having a passion for poorer communities in particular, and then poor kids of color, which is why, Mick, when you talk about trauma, that's something that's very near and dear to my heart, because in dealing with those kids, you know, you see it every day. And so my best friend and I, we were sort of like, I was coming out of Yale, she was coming out of Lincoln University, we met in Ghana, and we said, wow, look at us, two African-American young ladies, on sort of me, the human rights lawyer career, and her, the international development career, like who would have thunk it kind of thing. And sort of how do we provide this opportunity for others who just sort of wouldn't, or not the usual suspects, so to speak. So I ran One World for about 15 years, sending, you know, poor kids of color, largely college students abroad to Cambodia, India, all throughout Africa, including THRIVEGulu in Uganda, a very special place for me. And in fact, a large sort of catchment of our kids came out of post-Katrina New Orleans. This is in 2006, and a lot of them had been former gang members and were trying to sort of get their lives together. And so I think there was a lot of dynamic sort of points of sort of contact there with that work. And one of them was when we had those same Katrina survivors go to India, and they were working with the Dalits there, the so-called untouchables. And so like all the local media in India covered them, they had all this press, but seeing sort of how here are these kids coming from the US, and here are these sort of so-called untouchable Dalit kids, and yet a lot of the issues were similar, right? And a lot of the sort of being shut out of society was very similar. And so, so that was the work that I was doing for the past 15 years. And then literally about this time last year, I get a call from LinkedIn. So I guess it is possible to get positions from LinkedIn. I wasn't looking for it, but a recruiter called and said, hey, look, you know, we have this opportunity and we're looking for the right person and we think you're it. And I was like, I don't know, you know, I'm happy with One World. And so they were like, well, no, we really, really think you could be the one to do this work. And it was leading this coalition. And so I think I'll just go right into the actual presentation of that. So now here I am. Can you all see this? I hope you can. Okay, awesome. So I, you know, went through the whole process, and now here I am. I'm finding myself the CEO of ReflectUS. And so ReflectUS is a coalition. And you know what, I'll start with this quote because it's sort of where we ground our work. So our work is all about increasing gender parity in US political leadership, both at the local, the state, and the federal, national level. And sort of one of our guiding principles is this quote by Ruth Bader Ginsburg: women belong in all places where decisions are being made. It shouldn't be that women are the exception, right? So how do we, when we think about sort of a reflective democracy, right? How do we think about who's making those decisions that impact our day-to-day lives, right? And how do we create a political system in which, you know, everyone can participate and wants to participate in political leadership? So ReflectUS is one coalition. So I head the actual coalition, the umbrella, and it's of 9 organizations. It's nonpartisan. So we have both left-leaning and right-leaning and independent organizations a part of ReflectUS. Each of our coalition members do different types of work to increase gender parity. So I kind of liken it to sort of like the Avengers, right? Where you have sort of all these superheroes that kind of come together to save the world. So the member organizations that ReflectUS are very much like that. They're doing everything from training, basically creating a pipeline, to system changes, right? So things such as when you think about campaign donations and how, you know, you can, you know, raise millions of dollars in campaign donations, but yet that money can't go towards childcare. And for women, that's a real barrier in that way. And there's other barriers as well that a lot of our member organizations work toward. So I talked about that a bit. Our mission is both institutional change and capacity building. So we engage, train, and empower women from all backgrounds, including ideological, who represent the lived experiences of our communities, to run for office and be appointed to office. And that's one thing we're really working on this election cycle, is that one of the big pipelines that a lot of folks don't think about is the appointment process and who's being appointed to these positions, both at the national level and the state level. And it's also just the training, right? How to train to run for office. And the training is everything from, you know, how to build a campaign team, to how to finance, to even imposter syndrome, right? Which is really big for a lot of people who are sort of not in well-resourced communities, and particularly for women, the feeling that you don't have what it takes to run. And so there's been studies done that like men have to be asked probably once to run for office, whereas women have to be asked multiple times. And a lot of times for men, it's sort of like, well, yeah, I should have been asked. And you know what? I need to run for president. Whereas for women, you know, it's like actually convincing them to run. And even then, when women run, it's usually sort of like for the local school board or for the local town council, sort of those issues that like directly impact them that they want to have a say in. So women by the numbers. So again, being the internationalist, I sort of ground myself in the international perspective. So I'm always looking outside of the US and seeing what's happening globally. And, you know, our numbers, if we look at our peer countries, particularly our peer Western European countries, to say the least, to say that they're abysmal would kind of be an understatement. Nearly 100 years after women won the right to vote, we still remain severely underrepresented. So right now, if you look at state legislatures across the country, women are only about 28.8% of those state legislatures, 7,383. If you look at statewide executives, women only hold about 27.6 of those positions, or 86 women hold statewide executive offices across the country, of 312 that are available. And then if you look at our US Congress, right, so we're looking at the Senate and the House of Representatives, that's only about 23.7% of women who hold those seats. So clearly we're nowhere near gender parity in this country. If you look at other countries like Germany, like England, a lot of our, again, peer countries, and even our not peer countries. So right now we're probably ranked like 86 in the world alongside like Afghanistan, Iran, you know, countries where in a lot of other categories you wouldn't want to be sort of in the same kind of, you know, place holding as, and that's where we find ourselves. And, you know, for me, it's not just sort of a numbers game, but study after study has shown that the more women are in office, the more that just gets done. So like even this highly partisan nature that we find ourselves in now, which like stuff just can't get done. When you get more women in the room, be it on the right or on the left, you know, just, you know, bills get passed and sort of work gets done. And we've seen it even in this sort of current pandemic. If you just look at female leadership across the globe, everywhere from New Zealand, right, and how the prime minister there has handled the crisis, to even Angela Merkel, how she's handled the crisis. It's just a different type of governing that women do. And it's, you know, a lot of it is like the servant leader type of governing that women tend to do that actually has, you know, real impact for everyone. So our solution to this issue is fueling discourse, right? So we have a very huge national, what we call Hearts and Minds campaign. So I'm going to be doing like quite a bit between now and Tuesday, and probably post Tuesday on podcast, NPR. We're on, you know, MSNBC, Fox News, the whole to-do. We're really data driven. So looking at sort of what are the numbers, the number of women that we're serving, what's keeping women from running from office, sort of what are those barriers that are keeping women from running. And then once they get elected, right, how do we make sure that they get on the committees they need to get on to really affect the change that we want to see? And empowering partnerships, that's what this coalition is really all about. Partnerships among the 9 organizations that's a part of the coalition, but then outside partnerships. So some of our big partners are USOW, USO Women. That's a big sort of coalition that came out of actually the Obama administration, but also, although it's nonpartisan, but also YWCA is a big partner of ours. So really just sort of, you know, the League of Women Voters is another big partner of ours. And all of this is towards champion parity, again, both at the local, state, and federal level. And what we're finding is that this year in particular, as with 2016, it's the highest number, it's record-breaking actually, number of women running for office at the national level, and that just kind of trickles down to the state and local levels. So again, how do we increase those numbers? So these are the members of our coalition. They span ideological lines. Also, some of them work with particular communities. So APACS, for instance, works with Asian American women. She Should Run works with younger women. Higher Heights is really sort of the behemoth, as it were, of African American women, getting them elected. Kamala Harris actually came out of Higher Heights. We have Latinas Represent. WPLN, there is a very, very interesting story regarding the success. And again, it's the low numbers on both sides of the aisle, but women, Democratic women seem to have more of success just because of how sort of the party makeup there versus Republican women. So WPLN is really sort of the agent that's really trying to drive training and trying to get more Republican women elected. So this is the 9 members of our coalition. So really, we're trying to bridge traditional women's representation efforts by working together in partnership around institutional change, capacity building to really accelerate gender parity in our political landscape, working across the country. We're going to be announcing the middle of November, so the middle of next month, our From the Ground Up state network. So one of the areas where I see a gap in this work is really when you talk about socioeconomic barriers. And a lot of this work, when you talk about women running from office, has really been focused on those women who have some access to resources. And so we need more women there as well. But when you talk about working class women, poor women, they're just not a part of the conversation, but a lot of them are leaders in their own communities already. So we're really reaching out. We're going to be working in 5 states and really working with local partners, everyone from our farming associations to our welfare rights organizations, really trying to build the capacity of, poor, lower income women who, of all people in this country, are really, really facing the impacts of policy. So who are we touching? The 9 organizations and ReflectUS, about 100. This is probably really more like 200,000 women to count. At this point, we're racially diverse, ideologically diverse, and really beginning to have a national impact and hoping really to sort of see that dial really shift and that number really go up. I talked about the state network and how we're really focusing on grassroots organizations. One of our first pilot programs has been in Dallas County, North Texas, and we've seen like a huge shifting there. We're also developing fellowship programs for these women, both in Dallas County as well as in our state network, to really just go deep and really give them deep support as they seek political leadership. So here are the ways if you want to follow our work. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. That's my email address. And, I think, as we, get closer to Tuesday, and there was a lot of excitement around the Kamala Harris announcement in regards to what side of the aisle that you're on, just because, there's a woman that's sort of, at the top of the ticket. And I think that, as we think about a lot of the issues that we're facing in this country, one of the biggest ones to me is gender parity in politics, right? That just kind of really goes sort of unsaid. So hopefully the more that, ReflectUS as the work that, I'm trying to do with the organization to really, uplift this issue, the more change that we hope to see.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Before I turn a couple of questions internationally, somebody had a question about how do you identify your local partners?
I'm going to stop sharing now. So for me, I kind of, where I start my work is really at the local level. And so for me, once I got back from abroad, I think it probably was Cambodia, my last sort of abroad trip. It was because it was right around Hurricane Katrina. And so I'm African-American from this country. And the whole time that I was, in Africa and in India doing all this, my family said, look, we have issues here. We have problems here. We have problems here. I'm like, oh, yeah, but, in Cambodia. And then voila, Hurricane Katrina happens. And I did take a job working in the Gulf Coast at that time, working with local grassroots organizations. So when I started at ReflectUS, I said, for those who know the women's rights movement a little bit, we know that there has been, or there was this underbelly of race and racism in that movement, right? So we just celebrated the 19th Amendment and the ratification of the 19th Amendment back in August. And at that point, it was largely an amendment that granted white women the right to vote. And it was sort of just, a very ugly history there. But what I can say once I started this position is that the field really has been very self-reflective about that. And they have begun to course correct when it comes to race. Again, it's not where it needs to be, but they have begun to do that. But I just see this gap, and it's really across the board in this country when it comes to poor people, right, and poverty. And I think that, working abroad saying someone's poor, saying someone's impoverished, it's not a dirty word. It's understood. It's when you come back home that it sort of becomes so politicized. And so for me, I said, this is just not a community of women that this work is not even touching. And by and large, you're really talking about the majority of women, working class women. And then with COVID, forget about it. It's just going to be even more extreme after we come out of this mess that we're in now. So for me, I, began reaching out to those same grassroots organizations that I, worked with during my Hurricane Katrina work and even my One World work. And whenever, we're just saying, look, we're doing a listening tour, maybe I'm crazy, but, your, grassroots leaders, which are largely women, be they, more conservative, white women in, rural communities in the Midwest, or, your African-American, Latino women, let's say in urban centers, a lot of these grassroots movements are like powered by women. Right? So they're already leaders in their communities, just that no one's thinking about them for political leadership. So each of these organizations, so Organizing Virginia is one organization we're working with. We're also looking at Vermont and working up there, Minnesota as well, Washington State and Arizona. And each one of these states where we go into and talk to like the local organizing folks are like, yeah, like 99% of our organizers are women. This would be perfect for them. So it's been a very organic conversation and very sort of commonsensical. So that's pretty much how we're finding our local partners.
Great. Is there a fee for any of these? Like, how do you fund this, or is there any cost to the women like who sort of agree to kind of start to go down this path of training to run a campaign or whatever?
Well, that's a good point. So it's a two-part question. I think up till probably maybe the past couple of years, this field, and again, the coalition members that I work with who are right here on my right-hand side, probably your left-hand side, they're the true believers. They've been doing this well before this field was even funded. But I will have to say after 2016, there's been a lot of focus in getting more women elected. And so for my organization in particular, and interestingly enough, for this conversation, a lot of the focus has come from U.S. financiers and, very wealthy individuals who before this were very much looking abroad. So Melinda Gates, for instance, has really been becoming very involved in this field. And she really kind of cut her teeth in Africa, right? And a lot of the work that the Gates Foundation has done in Africa. And after 2016, said, like I had that epiphany during Katrina, wow, there's some work we really need to do back at home, right? So she and others have really been very supportive of this movement over the past, I'll say 4 years. With respect to the work we're doing now, though, with working class women in our fellowship program, that will be something where we would pay them a stipend. At the end of the day, you have to meet people where they are. So again, Yale campaign, we're all coming out of Yale, has an amazing campaign school, as does Columbia, as does LBJ down in Texas. But again, a lot of that is calling, me, and I say all the time, if I were to go off and be president, which I wouldn't do, but I'm just not a political person in that way, but if I would, it would be a success in some ways. But then if you look at my background, like I went to Yale, I traveled the world, I went to Columbia Law School. It's almost like if we're not careful in this work, we'll make sort of the model of women ascension in politics at such a high bar. You know what I mean? Even Kamala Harris, I mean, my gosh, like she's brilliant. And she went, she was, an attorney general and all this other stuff. We almost will unwittingly make the bar so high that those who are starting, in their local communities won't even stand a chance. And so I'm just making sure that we really open this up and make it a rural representative democracy.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. That's just really so inspiring. Well, it sounds like you've got a lot of work to do over the coming weeks. I want to bring back a question then, but if people need to go, I think we're about at the a little past our time, but so thank you. And I was so proud to be partners and have you guys willing to come and talk to us about the work that you do. And there's a question that somebody raised, and it's probably a big one, and this probably comes up in the work that you did abroad, but also here, is about how did you, what happened? Have you ever dealt with host country pressures and corruption in any areas you work? And maybe the question is even, Tiffany, maybe in some of the work you're doing, have you ever found pushback from local organizations? But I think we started with sort of international questions. So Mick, let's start that back with you to answer that question. I think you started to respond.
Yeah, it's a great question and a very, very important one. It's also difficult to answer. I would think probably Neal has perspective on more of a national experience with that. I don't really, I have no work with the central government of Uganda, and I didn't really have any. I guess when I was in Cambodia, I worked with the Ministry of Interior quite closely, but and that actually had a policy component. But in Uganda, I'm not really doing any policy advocacy. But on the local level, there's a tremendous amount of corruption there as well. We try to make friends with all of the local officials as best as possible. We try to go through all the proper channels. If we're going into a new community, we start with all of the local leaders and the key figures and key stakeholders in those areas. We don't necessarily we don't endorse most of their policies and their practices and that sort of thing, but we do cultivate a strong relationship with them, and that helps because then we have access to things that we wouldn't normally have. So, for example, during this COVID crisis, the local government in Gulu district and other districts, essentially shut down most of the local NGOs. We, however, were kind of picked up by the Gulu district task force and health team, with the health team within the task force. And so we had, complete and total access to communities. So we could go in. I mean, granted, we had to maintain, we had to follow the restrictions and maintain, healthy and good practices with social distancing and all that. But we were able to deliver care during the early part of COVID-19 that very, very few organizations were able to do. And, I really attribute that to the fact that our leadership in Gulu is really good at negotiating and working with the local officials.
Well, thank you. Neal, any experiences dealing with local corruption and pushback from local governments in any of the places you went?
I would say it was harder on the political front than on the corruption front. I think there's so many things you can do and, in terms of following best practices and being transparent, and it's such a slippery slope. The minute you participate, even in a little way on the corruption front, you're in trouble. So it's better. And we certainly said, no way at all. The harder was really on the political front, because you had to be smart. And the cost of screwing up politically could be the security of your own team members who mostly were from those environments. And so while you wanted to address issues of human rights, while you wanted to address and point out issues of poor governance, you just had to be smart about it, build the right allies, build the right groups, and always think in terms that it's usually better to be effective than to necessarily think you're saying the right things, and to really measure your success by changes you see on the ground.
Good, excellent answer, and really good probing question. Tiffany, anything either from your international experience or maybe even now? It sounds like you're deep in the locals already, but I don't know, is there any pushback of like, why do we need more women in politics? I'm just curious.
Well, I'll just say in terms of sort of the corruption and sort of, being very attuned to sort of the environment that one's in. One of the things that sort of was always the guiding principle for One World is making sure that we took our cues from those on the ground. And it's the same for ReflectUS. So whenever, for instance, with One World, we had we're sitting, college kids abroad. So the maturity levels and sort of the experience, a lot of these kids don't even have passports, right? So a lot of the issues we would face with One World is sort of just not this past summer, but summer of 2019, we had a group in Cameroon. Right. And so, I got a call at like 7 a.m. with like my kids in Cameroon, and it's like some police officer there who's like threatening to throw them in jail because they don't have their passports, or like they don't really need their passports. He's really trying to shake them down, and they don't realize that. And luckily we have support at like, the State Department. So we got on the phone with the folks there, but the same thing in India as well. So I think sometimes there's a push as Westerners to really sort of go in and kind of be high-handed about the work that we're doing. But I think it's so important that we're in tune to sort of like the people that we're servicing, the communities we're servicing, and hearing from them. And if you take your cues from them, then like, you know, they're the best barometer, right, of sort of how much to push and where to push. And it's the same with this ReflectUS work. As we're going into poor communities, like I would never go into like, you know, we're looking between Minnesota and Missouri. So let's just say Missouri, for instance, we're deciding between the two states for this state network, looking at what just happened in Ferguson, right? Just a couple of years ago, I would never sort of parachute down to Ferguson, assuming that sort of I know that context and that climate, right? Like you definitely have to get your cues from those who like have the lived experience.
Amazing. Yeah, being good listeners. We could all, everybody in our country could use a little more of that. Well, I want to say thank you to our panelists and our speakers. Thank you for the work that you've done and you've continued to do. I hope you'll stay in touch, keep us updated, and we'll hopefully bring you back at some point. Ken, our fearless leader, did you want to pipe in and say anything before we say goodnight?
Only to say thank you to our speakers and Rachel, to you as well. Just brilliant job moderating. Thank you, everyone.
Excellent, everybody. We'll have this thing recorded and shared so you can continue to refer back. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great evening. We'll see you at our next program.
Good night.
You all.
Good night.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.